In December 2011, 20-year-old Morgan Ingram was found dead by her parents after she had allegedly been stalked for 4 months. The autopsy determined she had died from natural causes, but her parents believe she was murdered by the stalker. Were their suspicions correct, or was there an equally dark explanation that wasn't so obvious? Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can become a Ko-fi member or a channel member to gain access to uncut videos and other perks, or you can leave me a tip by clicking the thanks under this video. Thanks to anyone who considers this. This video will cover topics that some might find triggering, including murder, suicide, OD, and Munchausen by proxy. Viewer discretion is advised. The theories discussed in this video were based on information gathered from various sources online and are just speculation, not facts. Please do not attempt to contact or harass anyone mentioned in this video. 20-year-old Morgan Ingram lived with her parents Tony and Steve in Carbondale, Colorado. She had an older brother and an older sister, both of whom had left the family home years prior. Morgan's parents described her as a loving and caring soul with a passion for dancing, art and photography. She had completed a 2-year degree at a local college and planned to continue studying with the eventual goal of applying for law school. These plans for the future would begin to feel further out of reach though when a number of concerning incidents led Morgan to believe she was being stalked. In August 2011, Tony made a police report after someone had been tapping on Morgan's window and throwing rocks at it. The first time Morgan had told her parents about this, Steve walked outside expecting to see a branch that had been blowing into the window, but there was nothing within 10 feet of it. 2 days later, Morgan was about to take a shower. The window was slightly open, and when she went to close it, a fist hit the window. She ran into her parents' room, and her father said he spent hours chasing around the neighborhood, trying to imagine how he could catch this person. Obviously, Morgan was very shaken up after this incident, and that night she slept on the floor of her parents' walk-in closet, where she ended up sleeping every night for nearly a month after that. They decided to install security cameras and motion sensors, hoping to catch the stalker in the act. They even put a panic button in Morgan's room so she could alert them if anything happened. The parents implied that someone was trying to tamper with the home alarm and reported hearing someone typing in the keypad. They claimed that they called the police for 55 days before a detective was finally assigned to the case, and it was classed as a federal stalking case. They didn't want Morgan to be home alone, and if she went out, usually in Tony's car because hers needed repairing, Tony would meet her outside and walk her into the house with pepper spray or a stun gun in case anyone tried to attack her in the driveway. Her dad would park somewhere off the main road to follow her at night when she was on her way home to see if anyone was following her. Morgan cancelled her plans to move away for college and was living in constant fear. But who was the stalker? 6 months earlier, Tony's car had been keyed and the word bitch had been written on it when Morgan had borrowed it, and they believed one of their neighbours called Brooke was responsible. I think Brooke was around 17 at this time, but I wasn't able to find out her exact age. She and her boyfriend at the time, Keenan, lived with Brooke's family just 3 houses down, and Tony believes that they were behind these incidents of stalking. At one point, the security cameras caught a man walking up to the house, briefly looking at it before turning around and walking away. Morgan apparently instantly recognized this man as Keenan, telling her parents she was pretty confident it was him. Additionally, they had found shoe prints in the mud outside their home, and after they eventually moved out, they noticed a cracked pipe on the outside of the house in the spot the stalker would have had to stand to tap on Morgan's bathroom window. They showed the footage to the police, who spoke with Keenan, but they didn't have enough evidence to charge him with any crime. They assured the family they would put extra patrols on the house, but this didn't seem to help, and the stalking continued. On the 1st of December, Morgan took her mother's car to go out with her friends. Presumably worried for her safety, Tony called and texted Morgan multiple times, but she didn't answer or reply. Eventually, her father texted her, and she told him she'd be home soon. They tried to get her to come home earlier by saying they'd take her to her favourite restaurant, and when she declined, they went to the shop to buy all her favourite foods and returned home to wait for her. When she finally arrived, Tony had words with her, and she called Tony a bitch before storming off to her bedroom and slamming the door. Later that evening, Steve went to talk to her, quote, "I went in her room and she was lying on her stomach on the bed and she was wearing flannel jammy bottoms and a cami top. We just talked about life. We did this often, and she was happy. I said goodnight, and she said, 'I love you, Daddy.' I walked out the door and I thought everything was going to be fine, and obviously nothing was fine." The next day would be the worst day of Steve's life. Quote, "I had gotten up and I was in the kitchen, and then Tony got up and went into her bedroom. Then I heard her coming down the hall that, 'Steve, there's something wrong. I can't wake Morgan up.' And so I went running into her room and I leaned over her bed, and you just think everything is going to be fine. You think, okay, she just won't wake up. She's just extra sleepy this morning. I grabbed her shoulder and I shook it, and then I shook it some more, and then I pulled her blankets down, and it was so odd. The way that she was positioned, just everything looked wrong. One of her arms was kind of elevated up off of the bed and it was in the air, and I pulled her over on her side, and now both of her arms were up like this." Tony described what she saw. Her knees were bent, so she looked like she was in a semi-fetal position. Her eyes were wide open and black. I mean, it was just the scariest thing. Her hair was all matted. She had blood on her forehead. I mean, it was just bad. Her bottom lip was swollen. Her nose was smashed. She was on the wrong side of the bed. Everything was wrong. They called 911 and moved her to the floor to attempt CPR. Paramedics arrived shortly after and tried to revive her, but it was too late. Morgan was gone. An investigation was launched into the unexpected death, but 17 days later, the autopsy determined that she had died from acute intermittent porphyria, a genetic metabolic disorder. In disbelief, the parents pushed for another autopsy, and 8 months later, it was determined that Morgan had taken her own life by ODing on drugs. This conclusion didn't make any more sense to them than the initial finding that Morgan had died from natural causes. They don't believe that she would have taken her own life. She'd spoken to her father the night before and seemed happy, and in her final Facebook post, she'd said, "I love life." They pointed out a number of suspicious details surrounding her death that led them to believe that she was murdered. They didn't believe it looked like she died of natural causes or an OD. There was blood on her forehead and coming out of the side of her mouth. Her lips were swollen, her neck was purple as if someone had tried to strangle her, yet the autopsy showed no indication of any trauma. Although Morgan had been wearing her pajamas when Steve spoke with her the night before, when they found her body the next day, she was wearing jeans and a shirt, and the jeans were unbuttoned and unzipped. They believe this may indicate that she was SA'd. The pajamas she had been wearing were nowhere to be found, and a number of other items were missing from her room, including valuable jewellery, one piece being one of Tony's bracelets. The panic button that Steve had installed a few weeks prior had been torn off from where it was mounted, and they later found it in the corner of the room under a pile of Morgan's clothes. Her phone was found under the bathroom door, and the light had been left on in there, which was strange because she apparently never left this light on. Her puppy and her cat were both shut in the bathroom, also strange because they never got along, and yet they were just sat there as if they were in shock. Steve said that an investigator contacted them years later and asked if Morgan knew sign language. He told them she did, she'd taught herself, and wondered why they would ask that. The investigator said that after looking at the photos of her body, it appeared that she was signing two letters, K and N. The parents believed that Morgan had done this right before she died to tell them who had killed her, and that the K and N meant Keenan. The second autopsy had found that Morgan had taken a lethal dose of amitriptyline, a drug used to treat depression and abdominal pain and headaches, that she had been prescribed for pain, not depression. A bottle of amitriptyline pills was found by police in Morgan's room, alongside propranolol, a beta blocker which she had also been prescribed. Around 6 months later, the gastric contents of her stomach were tested, and high levels of Flexeril, a muscle relaxant, were found. Morgan did not have a prescription for Flexeril, and some sources claim this drug has been used as a date rape drug, though others dispute this. Tony and Steve believe this is further proof that someone else was involved in her death. They suggested that someone may have either injected her with liquid amitriptyline or fed her the pills, implying that that someone was Keenan, who they thought had been stalking her in the 4 months prior to her death. Tony pointed out that Brooke's mother worked at a horse farm where she may have had access to liquid amitriptyline intended for use on horses, and that could be how Brooke and/or Keenan obtained it. Despite all the evidence that seemingly contradicted the autopsy's findings, the case was closed, leaving Tony with no option but to raise awareness of her daughter's suspicious death online. She posted on various sites, including web sleuths and Reddit, and created a blog, which is still active to this day, detailing the events running up to Morgan's death, particularly the stalking, and naming Keenan and Brooke as the people responsible. Tony and Steve actually appeared on the Dr. Phil show alongside Brooke and her father. They maintained their belief that Brooke was involved in the stalking and perhaps the murder of Morgan. Brooke denied this and stated there is no evidence of her involvement and that she had no reason to stalk or murder Morgan. Although Keenan declined the invitation to appear on the show, he has spoken out elsewhere, also maintaining his innocence and explaining how these allegations have negatively impacted his life. On the surface, this case might seem pretty suspicious. A young woman is stalked for 4 months, then dies unexpectedly of an OD, despite showing no signs of extreme depression in the time leading up to her death. Surely it's not beyond the realm of possibility that she was murdered. Thing is, you can make just about any death sound suspicious if you control the narrative and conveniently leave out important details. It's not exactly true that Morgan showed no signs of depression prior to her death. In fact, friends had told police that she had been acting a little differently and seemed a bit withdrawn. Her ex-boyfriend, who she had remained friends with, said that she had been complaining of chest pains recently, that she was under a lot of stress, had been using prescription drugs recreationally, had started hanging around with a new group of friends, and that she had taken cocaine at least once in the past 2 weeks. Another of her friends said that he had spoken with her on the phone a few days before her death and that she was crying. He also said Morgan had tried cocaine for the first time at least once in the month before she died, but to his knowledge, she didn't take much medication and didn't drink often. 2 weeks before her death, Steve recalled that Morgan had said that life wasn't worth living, though still insisted to police that she couldn't have taken her own life. The last sentence in her diary read, "I've completely lost my cool." It wasn't clear exactly when this was written, as there were no dates. In any case, the parents claimed that Morgan was terrified because of the stalking. She was living in fear, but also claimed that she was happy and would have no reason to take her own life. Both of these things can't be true at the same time. Either she was terrified and the stalking had affected her significantly, in which case that would be a pretty valid reason for not wanting to be alive, or she was happy and wasn't that bothered about the stalking. The second possibility seems pretty implausible. Who wouldn't be affected by someone stalking them? Morgan had decided not to go to college because of the situation. That's quite significant considering she was apparently excited to embark on the journey to law school. Surely she wouldn't give up her dream without a very good reason. Most of the information seems to suggest that Morgan was struggling in the time running up to her death, so the conclusion of the second autopsy really isn't that unbelievable. Naturally, this would be a very hard fact for her parents to accept. As awful as the death of a child would be under any circumstances, in some ways it'd be even worse if your child chose to die. You'd constantly be torturing yourself, wondering if there was anything you could have done to prevent it. Tony and Steve already blamed themselves for various mistakes that they had made that may have allowed the hypothetical stalker to enter their house that night. They'd probably blame themselves even more if they accepted the possibility that Morgan had chosen to die. It's hardly surprising that they have cherry-picked information to make it look like someone else was involved, while ignoring anything that hints at the more plausible theory. The murder theory just doesn't make sense though. How could someone have entered the house without the family noticing, including the dogs, and without being caught on the security cameras? The parents believe someone could have snuck in while they were out for a couple of hours and hidden somewhere until Morgan returned, but somehow they still weren't caught on the camera. There were no signs of forced entry, so unless they were leaving doors unlocked, which, given the stalking situation, seems unlikely, how would someone have entered, even if no one was home at the time? Tony has come up with various ways, suggesting they somehow obtained a key or found out the code to the door, but really, there are no plausible ways anyone could have pulled this off. Morgan died due to an OD of drugs that she had been prescribed. Remnants of these pills were found in her stomach, showing she wasn't injected with any drugs, as Tony had suggested. Forcing someone to consume enough pills to OD wouldn't be the simplest of tasks, especially while their parents are in the house and would inevitably react to any noises they heard. They suggested someone had used chloroform to knock her unconscious, but then how would she have swallowed the pills? Same can be said for Flexeril. How would someone force her to take it? And if she was left incapacitated after taking it, how would she swallow the amitriptyline? It's much more likely that she took these pills herself. She had been prescribed amitriptyline, and if her friend is to be believed when they said she was taking prescription drugs recreationally, perhaps that's why she had Flexeril. With this in mind, I guess it's not beyond the realm of possibility that she accidentally OD'd, though she did have a very high level of amitriptyline in her blood. According to Michael Dobison, one of the 27 experts that Tony and Steve contacted to review the case, normally if someone was taking amitriptyline as prescribed, the level would be 50 to 250. Toxic levels are usually considered anything over 500, and now consider that she's almost got 8,000 nanograms per milliliter in her blood, which is extremely high. The parents will claim that this is proof that someone forced her to take the drugs, but while it might make it unlikely that she accidentally took that many for recreational purposes, it certainly doesn't rule out her choosing to take them to end her life. But what about the stalker? Isn't it worth at least considering that they might have been involved in Morgan's death? Well, turns out there isn't that much evidence to suggest there even was a stalker. The police were contacted many times regarding the incidents of stalking, but Tony was the only person making these reports. It's easy to forget, because of the way her parents talk about her, that Morgan was a 20-year-old woman. She was an adult. She lived with her parents, and of course at that age you still have a lot to learn. Your maturity level isn't the same as someone who's 30, 40 or 50, but she wasn't a child. If the stalking was as severe as her parents claim, why didn't she personally report it to the police? A lot of her behaviour in general wasn't really consistent with her being terrified of this alleged stalker. She still went out to walk her dog and see her friends, and although Tony would meet her at the car when she returned home and escort her inside armed with pepper spray, she still went out by herself. In fact, not a single incident occurred outside the home. It was always just someone apparently tapping on her windows at home. Nothing else and nowhere else. Even some of the behaviour of her parents doesn't really align with their stalking claims. In an interview, when trying to explain why the stalker wasn't caught on camera tapping on the bedroom window while Morgan was sleeping in their closet, Tony said they must have known she wasn't in there, that he probably heard, through the open window, her asking Morgan if she was okay in the closet. For a start, why on earth would you leave any windows open if you believe someone is stalking your daughter? Secondly, what a bizarrely specific thing to say, with the window open, while someone is stalking your daughter. Morgan decided not to go to college because of the stalking, but why would her parents not have encouraged her to go? If they really thought she was being stalked by Brooke and Keenan, who lived 3 houses down, wouldn't she have been safer moving away? It's pretty unlikely they're going to move home and follow her there. There also doesn't appear to be much of a motive here. Keenan was in a relationship at the time. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean he didn't for some reason become obsessed with Morgan, but it's not like he was a stereotypical loner who didn't have anything else going on, and regardless, the parents believed that Brooke was in on it. Keenan was interviewed by police a few months after Morgan's death, and he did mention that Brooke didn't particularly like Morgan, but it's one thing not liking someone and another going to the lengths of stalking them. Keenan was never charged with anything related to the stalking or alleged murder of Morgan, and neither was Brooke. It's also worth noting that at the time the footage was captured by the security cameras showing a man outside the house that the family claimed was Keenan, he was actually on a hunting trip in Texas, so it couldn't have been him. The footage itself wasn't nearly as suspicious as the parents paint it to be. To me, it looks like the man, whoever he was, approached the house, probably visiting a friend or something, and realised he'd got the wrong house. It's interesting that this is basically the only so-called evidence caught by the cameras. They had multiple set up outside, and yet there's no footage of anyone tapping on the windows, no footage of anyone breaking into the house the night before Morgan's body was found, absolutely nothing incriminating. A lot of the details that make it sound like Morgan may have been murdered have come directly from the parents, with no evidence backing up their claims. They say someone must have stolen Morgan's clothes because they found her wearing jeans and a shirt, but only her father had seen her wearing pajamas the night before. They claimed that jewellery was missing from her room, including one of Tony's bracelets, but how would they know it had been stolen? What if Morgan left it at a friend's house or misplaced it? We only have their word that it was unusual that the dog and cat were shut in the bathroom door with the light on, and even if this is true, if Morgan did take her own life, it's possible that she put the animals in the bathroom so they wouldn't see her dying. As for the panic button being torn off the mount, again, we only have their word for this, and it is possible that Morgan removed it for some reason. The fact is, I haven't seen a single detail that could suggest foul play that has actually been verified beyond the word of the parents. Now, I'm not suggesting they're lying, they could have been mistaken on some of these details, but there is also a pretty good reason for them to embellish the story. If they really thought she was murdered, making her death sound more suspicious would hopefully result in the case being reopened, especially with the support of potentially thousands of people online. Or the reason could be much darker. A few years ago, the Sword and Scale podcast covered Morgan's story in 2 separate episodes. I'm pretty sure both these episodes have since been deleted, as I couldn't find them anywhere on their website or elsewhere, but I did manage to find an archive of them. The host, Mike Boudet, was pretty critical of the parents, particularly Tony, and poked holes in a lot of what she'd said in interviews. Towards the end, he proposed the theory that Tony might actually have Munchausen by proxy. He didn't go into much detail, but there's been a decent amount of further speculation on this since, and I personally think it is a possibility, so let's take a look at the information behind this theory. I'll preface this by saying that it is just a theory. Obviously, Tony hasn't been diagnosed, and there's only so much we can determine from the information we have, and without knowing her personally or being professional psychiatrists. Munchausen syndrome, also known as factitious disorder, is a mental health condition that results in a person faking illnesses to gain attention and sympathy. Munchausen by proxy is a type of abuse in which caregivers or parents, usually mothers, fabricate or even induce symptoms of illness in others, usually their children. Anyway, according to Morgan's parents, she was sick for a large part of her childhood. Most notably, when they were renting an apartment many years before her death, she suffered with various symptoms, some of which were similar to flu. They visited various specialists over the period of about a year, but no one could determine what was causing these symptoms, nor could they provide a diagnosis. It's worth noting that this is what the parents claim. We have no way of knowing if Morgan actually was diagnosed with something that adequately explained her symptoms, or if she was in fact experiencing any symptoms at all. Anyway, at a loss, Steve decided to do some research online and narrowed down the cause to two possibilities, one of which was carbon monoxide poisoning. He bought a couple of carbon monoxide detectors, plugged them in, and the alarm went off, and from then on, the parents were convinced that Morgan's symptoms were caused by carbon monoxide poisoning. It's not clear whether their diagnosis was ever confirmed by any medical professionals. There are a few problems with this potentially unofficial diagnosis, though. Symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning include headaches, dizziness, nausea, fatigue, confusion, heart palpitations, shortness of breath, and drowsiness, among others, but not the flu-like symptoms that Tony claims Morgan had. Symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning typically last no longer than a couple of weeks, yet the parents claim that Morgan was still suffering the effects years later, until she received hyperbaric oxygen therapy within a couple of years before she died. The exact time of the treatment isn't clear. After this, Tony stated that Morgan felt great and was able to start ballet, ride a bike, and do various other physical activities that she had been unable to enjoy for years. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy can be used to treat carbon monoxide poisoning, but it would be done shortly after exposure, not years later, so this doesn't really add up. Furthermore, the parents claim that Morgan was exposed to high levels of carbon monoxide, and she was ill for a long time after, but why was she the only person to experience symptoms? It doesn't make sense that she would be so ill from the exposure and somehow the parents were totally fine, despite living in the same house as her. This illness that Morgan purportedly had is arguably explained better by Tony having Munchausen by proxy. It's not uncommon for people with this to claim their child has symptoms that conveniently can't be diagnosed, and for them to then find some obscure explanation for it. Another discrepancy in Morgan's medical history is porphyria. This refers to a group of inherited blood disorders that results from a buildup of certain chemicals related to red blood cell proteins, causing symptoms including severe pain in the abdomen, chest, legs, or back, constipation, nausea and vomiting, breathing problems, anxiety, confusion, and hallucinations. The first autopsy determined that Morgan had died due to porphyria, and Steve actually told the police shortly after her death, before the autopsy, that she suffered with acute intermittent porphyria, or AIP, and was being treated for it. It's interesting to note that many AIP symptoms during an acute attack are similar to symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning, So if Morgan had AIP, it's possible that her parents could have mistaken it for carbon monoxide poisoning. Also remember that her ex-boyfriend said she complained of chest pain shortly before her death, and this is also one of the symptoms. Of course, it turned out that AIP was not the cause of death, but I'm guessing she did have it if the coroner initially thought that had killed her, unless he had just heard Steve said she had it and chalked it up to that without actually verifying. However, Tony denied that Morgan had any type of porphyria, directly contradicting her husband. This is pretty bizarre. AIP patients are typically asymptomatic, so it's entirely possible that Morgan could have had AIP without her parents knowing, but then why would Steve tell police she had it? It's a pretty obscure illness to think of off the top of your head, and considering the first autopsy seemingly confirmed that she did have it, I'd be inclined to believe that she had at some point been diagnosed with it. So why would Tony deny this? Perhaps because it didn't fit her narrative? Or maybe she had at one point come up with this diagnosis, told Steve, then changed her mind and forgot to inform him. While Steve seems pretty convinced himself that Morgan was murdered, I do get the vibe that he just goes along with a lot of what his wife says, without really thinking too much about it. That's just my perception though. If Morgan had been diagnosed with AIP, she should not have been taking amitriptyline. This drug can precipitate AIP attacks, so it's unlikely that a doctor would have prescribed it, knowing Morgan had AIP. This makes me wonder if AIP was just another illness that Tony claimed Morgan had without an actual diagnosis, and perhaps the coroner did just take Steve's word for it and assumed that was the cause of death in the first place. Some have wondered if the coroner knew that Morgan died of an OD all along, but put the cause down as AIP to make it easier for the parents, or so they'd still be able to claim on life insurance, which may have had exceptions if a person chose to die. Another detail that's worth noting is that Steve gave police a bottle of gabapentin, which is typically used to treat epilepsy and can also be taken for nerve pain. He said that the drug was Morgan's, but that he kept it and only gave it to her when she needed it. According to the NHS, it takes at least a few weeks for gabapentin to work, so it sounds like it wouldn't have benefited Morgan at all if she just took it occasionally. It's not even clear why she would be taking it, as her parents never claimed she had epilepsy, and she was already taking amitriptyline for pain. I'm not a doctor, but my research suggests that it's not usually recommended to take gabapentin and amitriptyline together unless absolutely necessary, because the combination may increase side effects. The police report states that Morgan was taking 3 pills at a time, which is more than the recommended dosage of 1 tablet 3 times a day. The writer of a blog, Truth for Morgan, which aims to present the facts about this case, claims that a confidential source shared the following information. In the last year of her life, Morgan was seen by the emergency department more than 15 times for stomach pain. In fact, Morgan was presented to the ED with stomach pain just days before she died. The doctor noted she was hallucinating and she thought she was being watched, both symptoms consistent with porphyria. Tony was very actively involved in Morgan's medical treatment. It was not unusual for her to try to direct Morgan's medical care based on her own research. She tried to have a standing order put in place with the ED for the medication she felt worked best for Morgan's AIP attacks. The only reason Morgan did not have a definitive diagnosis of AIP is because Tony refused the genetic test due to the high cost, though they were able to afford their rent in excess of $2,500 per month, eating out several times a week, a Land Rover, iPhones, and iMacs. A definitive diagnosis of AIP could have opened up the option for Morgan to receive prophylactic infusions of heme. Before the Ingrams decided Morgan was murdered, they insisted her stalking led to a stress-induced AIP attack that killed her. Maybe take some of that with a pinch of salt, considering the source is confidential, but the blog does seem relatively reliable in my opinion, and I'd recommend checking it out as it does a very good job of debunking just about every claim Tony has made related to her daughter being stalked and murdered. Anyway, the possibility that Morgan did have AIP could actually explain the alleged stalking. One of the symptoms is hallucinations, and it certainly wouldn't be unusual for one to think someone is tapping on their window if they are hallucinating. In April 2012, someone claiming to be Tony, and I have no reason to believe it wasn't Tony, considering this was before the case was really discussed online, posted in a forum claiming that when Morgan was 14, she was diagnosed with hyperalgesia, an increased sensitivity to pain, which apparently caused her to experience extreme pain whenever she tensed up or was under stress. The post also said, quote, "We believe her chronic stress from the stalker killed her." This post is very interesting because not only does it introduce yet another illness that Morgan supposedly had, or at least that Tony claimed she had, but it shows that the parents initially believed it was the stress of the stalking that had killed Morgan, not the stalker himself, not by directly murdering her at least. Tony's version of events is extremely inconsistent. Again, I'd recommend checking out the Truth for Morgan blog for many more examples of this, but she has gone from claiming that Morgan died due to stress because of the stalker, to saying that the stalker, namely Keenan, broke into the house and murdered her. Tony has contradicted herself numerous times when discussing Morgan's medical history, and claimed that she suffered with various illnesses that she either didn't have, or that were misdiagnosed by Tony. I want to make it clear that from the information we have, it seems that Morgan probably did suffer with some symptoms of an illness, or more than one illness, likely some kind of chronic pain issue. She had been prescribed drugs that can be used to treat chronic pain, but it's not clear if she did experience all the symptoms Tony has claimed, and Tony hasn't produced a solid and consistent explanation for the alleged symptoms. It's virtually impossible that it was caused by exposure to carbon monoxide when Morgan was a child, and this is the one explanation that Tony and Steve have both stuck with. It seems the only symptoms that were pretty consistent and/or were either corroborated by someone else, such as Morgan's friends, or were treated by the drugs she had been prescribed, were chest pain, stomach pain, and headaches. The other drug found in Morgan's system during the final autopsy that she didn't have a prescription for was Flexeril. Earlier, I suggested that Morgan may have taken this drug for recreational purposes, as her ex-boyfriend said she was taking prescription drugs recreationally, but Flexeril isn't exactly a common choice. I even found a few posts online discussing the recreational potential of Flexeril, and general consensus in drug forums seemed to be that it didn't really induce a high, and side effects weren't particularly desirable, so it seems unlikely that Morgan chose to take it for this purpose. What's interesting though is that Flexeril can cause chest pain, stomach pain, and headaches, the three symptoms that we can be fairly sure that Morgan was experiencing. It's unlikely that she chose to take Flexeril recreationally. We know she hadn't been prescribed it, and we can be fairly certain that no one else broke in and force-fed her it. Now, I'm not making any accusations here, this is pure speculation, but if Tony did have Munchausen by proxy, a condition where a mother may deliberately induce symptoms in their child, is it beyond the realm of possibility that she was sneakily giving Flexeril to Morgan, and that's what was causing her symptoms? The night before she died, Tony tried to bribe her to come home by offering to take her to her favourite restaurant, and then she went out to buy her favourite foods. Could she have spiked these foods with Flexeril, and that's how it ended up in Morgan's system? Again, that's just speculation, it's probably not the case, but perhaps it is worth considering. Anyway, I'll let you decide for yourself if you think Tony does have Munchausen by proxy, but I personally think overall it's a pretty compelling theory based on the available information. This leads to a few potential theories regarding the stalking and Morgan's death. And before we highlight these, it's important to remember the following things. While we can't totally rule out that Morgan was being stalked, there is simply no credible evidence to prove it. And there is no evidence to suggest that anyone else was involved in Morgan's death. The evidence suggests that she took her own life. So regarding the stalking, there are two possibilities. Tony genuinely believed that Morgan was being stalked, or she didn't, but for some reason tried to convince Morgan of it. I'm not sure if fabricating a stalking incident specifically would count as a symptom of Munchausen by proxy, or MBP, but the motivation behind it could absolutely align with MBP. If Tony had fabricated symptoms of illness for her daughter, and/or lied about what illnesses her daughter had been officially diagnosed with, and/or come up with her own obscure explanations that conveniently may have made her daughter's health sound much more mysterious than it actually was, and meant that anything Morgan may have suffered with was much harder to diagnose, Tony likely did this for attention and sympathy, as people with MBP do. And so fabricating incidents of her daughter being stalked would also likely be to gain attention and sympathy. Alternatively, or additionally, perhaps it was about control. What if Tony was trying to stop Morgan leaving home? Morgan planned to move out and go to college, and suddenly, just a few months before, a stalker popped out of nowhere and supposedly began terrorizing her, and she cancelled her plans to leave. Tony and Steve had two other children who were quite a few years older and had already left home. Morgan was the youngest child, and the last child the couple were feasibly going to have. Any mother is bound to be a little sad when their last child flies the nest, but a mother like Tony, who by all accounts seemed to be a helicopter parent, may have found this particularly difficult. If Tony did fabricate the stalking story, it makes sense that she's so hellbent on insisting Morgan was murdered because it would prove the stalking. But at what cost? Tony has publicly labelled both Brooke and Keenan as stalkers and murderers, and has implicated Brooke's parents too, none of whom likely had anything to do with Morgan's death. And yet their lives have been significantly impacted by it. Supporters of Tony and Steve have harassed them for years. A family friend even threatened to kill Keenan. The parents claim that Keenan and Brooke were stalking Morgan, and yet it's Keenan and Brooke that have actually been stalked. During the alleged stalking of Morgan, the parents would often check outside Brooke's house to see if Keenan's car was parked there. They'd pass by his workplace attempting to figure out his schedule. They'd spread their unproven allegations throughout the neighbourhood, monitored his Facebook page. Arguably, they were stalking him. As for Morgan, if she was being stalked, it appears this was also by her own parents. Steve himself admitted to following her at times to see if anyone else was following her. When she went out, her parents, particularly Tony, would bombard her with messages and calls, asking where she was and what time she'd be home, which would be perfectly reasonable if she was a child, but she was 20 years old, not 13. They admitted to trying to bribe her to come home the night before she died by offering to take her to her favourite restaurant and buying all her favourite foods. It's like they didn't want her to have a life outside the home. Of course, if they genuinely believed she was being stalked, it's natural that they'd be extremely concerned, but again, there's just no evidence to suggest this was the case. So the best case scenario seems to be that they were paranoid and delusional, and that Morgan suffered unnecessarily as a result. It's impossible to know whether or not Morgan herself genuinely believed she was being stalked. What we know of her actions don't really seem to align with someone who was terrified to do anything in case the stalker got to her. She was still going out with friends, walking her dog. She deliberately ignored her mother's texts and calls the night before she died, as if she was just fed up of being constantly hounded by Tony, not the stalker. Morgan never reported anything to the police herself, and some of her friends say that she had mentioned the stalking, but she never really went into much detail about it. Whether or not she ever thought she was being stalked in the first place, I personally get the vibe that towards the end, she realised it wasn't really much of a threat, and she was kinda just going along with what her mother said. I'm gonna read a comment I found on a Reddit post about Morgan's death. It's quite long, but it does a pretty good job of summarising how inconsistent Tony's story has been. It does go over some of the details I already covered, and some of the information contradicts the information I presented in this video, which again, demonstrates the extent of all the inconsistencies in this case, thanks to Tony. Most of the information I included in this video came from police reports and from interviews with Tony and Steve, so anything in this comment that contradicts it is an example of Tony changing her story, depending on whatever fits her narrative at the time. Anyway, here's the comment. A few years prior to the stalking, the family lived in a different house. Morgan had a pet ferret, and I think a bird as well. She started getting sick, headaches, lethargy, random but debilitating pains that weren't really localised to any one spot, but were just in her stomach area or her joints, then back to the abdomen. The story is that Morgan was eventually diagnosed with carbon monoxide poisoning. This is perfectly possible. It seems weird to me that the animals whose cages were in her bedroom didn't seem to suffer, but alright, whatever. So Morgan has years and years of medical care. Eventually, she has hyperbaric treatment, which Tony sometimes claims cured her. Other times, when she has to explain Morgan's reports of headaches or other pains, Tony switches gears and blames the CO poisoning. In the meantime, after their hyperbaric cure, Morgan is still being seen by specialists for her pain and tiredness. Eventually, they settle on a working diagnosis of porphyria. Great. Morgan starts being medicated for this condition and seems to improve. It's odd that her parents are rationing out her medication, and it's even odder that they seem to give her single doses when the pain is unbearable, instead of taking the medication daily as intended. But according to Tony, Morgan was feeling great overall. So great, in fact, that Morgan wanted to stop all her medication, which Tony went along with, despite her conviction that her daughter was suffering terribly and possibly at risk of death. Because that makes total sense for a parent of a chronically ill child to do. I mean, this woman wouldn't allow Morgan to get out of her car in her own driveway and walk the 10 feet to her front door by herself. Tony had to meet her in the driveway and escort her inside. When Morgan was terrified by the stalker, she slept on the floor in her mother's closet, but still balked at not being allowed to be in the house by herself or going out with her friends, or not attending dance or yoga classes when Tony forbade it. Again, it's completely rational that a mother would be this worried, this controlling, and this smothering of her adult daughter, but also let that daughter make major medical decisions like stopping all medication in defiance of her doctor's advice. Wait, not rational. I meant wholly inconsistent and a little bit crazy. Of course, there was still the bottle of amitriptyline Morgan kept in her room for some reason, and the medical marijuana, and the emergency dose of gabapentin she kept in her car in case of a pain attack. But she hadn't taken medication in a year, Tony says, other than the stuff that she did. Also, according to Tony, Morgan was in perfect health. She didn't take any medication, according to Tony. Sometimes, at least. Other times, she was a victim of her chronic pain caused by porphyria, until the ME declared Morgan's death to be caused by porphyria. Then Morgan was in perfect health again. Until people asked about the gabapentin and amitriptyline, then it was the CO poisoning. Until someone asks about whether Morgan might have been depressed over having a chronic pain condition, then the hyperbaric chamber cured her. Basically, if you think Morgan was ill and that it might have led to her death, natural or otherwise, then the truth is that she was in perfect health. And if you think Morgan was in perfect physical health, so perhaps her fatigue, pain, and possible auditory hallucinations, as if invisible rocks were hitting her window, were caused by a mental illness which may have contributed to suicide, then the truth is that Morgan had CO poisoning and/or porphyria and/or whatever else legitimizes her unwell state other than, say, clinical depression. Back in reality, there is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that the ME suspected suicide in the first place, but listed the COD as porphyria because he was told that Morgan had that illness. It was a reasonable COD. He wasn't suggesting she was hit by lightning or something that clearly didn't happen, and it allowed the parents and community the kindness of avoiding the stigma of suicide and drug abuse. Whether this was the right thing to do, morally or professionally, I think he made the call thinking it would ease the family's grief. He certainly didn't change the COD to suicide to punish Tony for demanding a review of the autopsy. But then another interesting thing happened after that. Tony says at one point that the COD can't be listed as porphyria because Morgan didn't have a definitive diagnosis, just a provisional diagnosis and treatment plan. She claims that there's an expensive genetic test for porphyria that was never done, and which can't be done now since all of the blood and tissue samples taken at autopsy had been used up or disposed of. She further claims that you can't put a disease as a COD unless the person has been diagnosed with it, which is obviously not true. A short time later, Tony talks about raising money for the genetic test. She also talks about raising money to preserve Morgan's remaining blood and tissue samples. You know, the same samples she couldn't use for the porphyria test because they don't exist, but also the same samples that are going to be used for the genetic test if only she had the money. But also the same samples that don't exist, so she can't get a second or third opinion from a third party and get the death certificate changed. Now I have to wonder where she got some of these ideas from. I don't think there's any legal requirement that a COD has to be from a diagnosed disease. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm 100% confident that you don't need a diagnosis to die of a disease. However, I wonder if there's an insurance requirement regarding diagnoses. I really don't know, but it seems to me that someone somewhere told Tony that something required a definite diagnosis, and she's extrapolating or confusing this other thing with a death certificate. On the other hand, she doesn't seem smart enough to come up with this objection completely on her own. On the other hand, she does seem smart enough to understand that if someone dies of undiagnosed cancer, their cause of death is cancer. If there was an insurance requirement, that could also explain why the ME decided to state the COD as porphyria rather than suicide in the first place. Again, whether or not this was legal or ethical isn't my point. He could have been trying to help out a family who already seemed to be in tight financial straits. Maybe the life insurance wouldn't pay out, or wouldn't pay out as much, or wouldn't pay out as quickly if the official cause of death was suicide. It would also explain why Tony interpreted the ME's warning that the only other possible cause of death he could list was suicide as a threat. Why would she take that statement as a threat? Pride, I suppose. Maybe religion. Or, money. I definitely don't believe that it was done to punish her personally, though she seems determined to believe it was. That's a totally unreasonable conclusion. So, Munchausen's by proxy, maybe, if you believe half of Tony's story, not if you believe the other half. An overbearing, emotionally disturbed mother with a flair for the dramatic and a tenuous grasp on what constitutes a believable lie versus an obvious falsehood, definitely. Behind the absolute mess that is this case, there is a young woman who tragically died too soon, two people who have been harassed and falsely accused of stalking and murder, and two parents who clearly aren't coping well with the loss of their daughter. I don't know for sure if Tony has MBP, but it could explain a lot. And while MBP is a mental illness, it's also a form of abuse. I have sympathy for Tony and Steve. I can't even imagine how awful it must have been to find their daughter's lifeless body, and how stressful their ongoing battle to reveal what they believe to be the truth is. But they've also inflicted a lot of suffering on people who almost definitely had nothing to do with Morgan's death. The pain they felt from Morgan's death has manifested into a witch hunt against Keenan and Brooke, and many others who have tried to share the truth about this case have also been targeted and harassed. And in the end, where has it got them? None of this will bring Morgan back, and the family will never find peace until they accept the reality of this tragic case. I truly hope, for their own sake and for everyone else who has been dragged into it, that Tony and Steve are one day able to come to terms with what happened, and that Morgan will finally be able to rest in peace. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments, as well as any other cases you might like me to cover in the future. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my Ko-fi members and channel members whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week in a new video.